Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Daniel and I were chatting a bit before the podcast started. And just to let you all know, Daniel and I cannot remember exactly how we met. Everybody likes to know how I know the guests. It was somehow through Facebook, in that he might have posted about a quit on maybe a friend's post. He commented something about a quit, and you know me, like quitting hound. I'm like, oh, I saw a quit. Can I talk to you? Do you have a quit? Let's hear about it. And of course he does, because he's fun, successful person who wants to do great things with the world, and you'll hear all about it. And most of those types of people did not necessarily wake up at age 16 and know exactly how they were going to change the world. So they have probably made a quit somewhere along the way, and Daniel is no exception. So Daniel, if you can take us back to when you were a web developer before your first significant quit.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I was a full stack web developer, and I'd always paid attention to forums and conversations with other programmers and web developers. A lot of, web developers who are funded by investors and so on, where we go to talk around the water cooler. And sometimes the older people would chime in and say, how they really didn't like their career and how they suffered in various ways. And occasionally somebody would pop in out of nowhere and say, I used to do that and I quit and I'm having an awesome time. And I'm like, wait a minute, who was that guy? Where did he come from? And so I always heard those people, but I never really latched on to them. And then I was a web developer working in a normal company. Thankfully, I was low stress, and for where I live in the Midwest, it was a very high salary. And people were arguing about the latest JavaScript framework, which is something programmers like to argue about. And I'd heard that discussion for 5 or 10 years. And I looked to the guy next to me, and his computer he was looking at YouTube, i.e. not working. And I was like, what are we doing? And we'd been making widgets and moving widgets around the screen. And I thought, this is kind of a make work. We're kind of making up work, and it's a waste of our time. So I printed off a picture of a surfer surfing a wave, and I put it next to my screen. I was like, I'm going to start saving the money and get out of here. And I'm going to go learn how to surf.
Nice. So what was your next step from there? So essentially your intuition started telling you this wasn't where you needed to be. What did you do from there once you had that little inkling that things needed to be changed?
Well, the previous context is that for many years I'd been involved in significant personal development, reading books, trying to read a book a week or at least every couple of weeks, studying with different rabbis, studying with different friends. I have a huge board where every quarter I make goals in 6 different areas: financially, socially, physically, intellectually. And I had an accountability partner every week for several years where we would talk to each other about our goals. So I was doing significant investments in personal development up until this point. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. And before this, I'd been kind of a vagabond living out of a backpack when I was younger, in my early 20s. So I had this bug in me anyway to travel and to move along, kind of like an old hobo on a train. So it didn't come out of nowhere.
Okay. And I just want to clarify, there's some nice cars rolling by because Daniel is still almost vagabonding just for a few days. He is homeless between homes. And you said you are in the Midwest. Where are you exactly located?
In Indianapolis.
Okay. I'm from Southern Illinois, which Midwesterners unite. Okay. You've decided, all right, I'm a vagabond. I can do this kind of life. So you said you started saving money. How long did you save up before you made the quit?
I think I'd been working at the job I was at maybe for 1.5 years, and my expenses were nil. So I just saved out all the money I made. And I got more and more interested in going back to school, even though I was 29. I thought it'd be really cool to study another language in another country and do the study abroad thing. So I was looking at different places to study, and I decided on one in Tel Aviv and one in Jerusalem. And so I'd been researching, and then when I saw the coworker on YouTube and I printed the surfboard picture, I decided now's the time. I'm going to go ahead and enroll in, I think it was fall classes at the time in Tel Aviv. So that was kind of when I made the purchase to enroll in fall classes. That was when it was official. And then I bought the plane ticket, even more official.
Did you have any fears in making that leap from a job that you said was making a good salary?
I wouldn't say a lot of fears, because for example, I don't have a family to support right now, and a lot of people don't have that situation. And I have a skill I can fall back on, which is web development, and I have the curiosity and self-discipline to learn a new skill if I need to. So I don't think the fear was financial, but I think the fear was going back on the road as a vagabond, leaving a secure situation for the unknown. And I guess if there was any fear, it was the fear that it's good to search the unknown as a vagabond or as a spiritual seeker, and that is not just being flaky. The fear has something to do with what does it mean to make a commitment to a place and to a job and to an identity and to a career, and not just being like Cat Stevens. I listen to the wind of my soul. Where I wind up, only God really knows. Like the fear was, is that a viable way to live your life? Like Siddhartha in the book by Hermann Hesse. So the fear has to do with confidence and taking the path less traveled, and when the culture is telling you that's flaky.
That's a really good point. I don't think anybody in 30 plus episodes has ever discussed the fear that wanting to do what you want to do and giving and the exchange that comes of that, which is essentially, leaving a company. What is more important? What, I guess at this point, what has more moral value at some point, right? Like is it flaky, which has a negative moral value, or is kind of the more we don't want to say selfish in the negative term, but the more self-directed, is that value more important? So how did you end up deciphering that for yourself?
To be determined. We live in the modern world. The reason why it's called the modern world is because the Judeo-Christian framework doesn't have a hold on us like it used to. And with that, the rise in individualism. So there's a breakdown in community and a breakdown in tradition. So if you ever read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, or you're influenced at all by the 60s and the search for authenticity and finding your bliss, all that is a very modern idea. It's kind of the antithesis of identifying with responsibility to your community, to your parents, to your tradition. Like, think about the Amish. They don't think about it. They just do it. So this whole thing is a very modern idea, and I'm still not sure what's the better way, or what's the right balance of individuation and community focus.
And I understand that, but at least in the situation that was presented to you, you decided at that point that it was more important for you to go ahead and follow your path to Israel than your dedication to the company. So how did you, at least in that specific instance, make the decision? Or overcome the fear that it was a flaky thing versus a legitimate reason?
I think in programming world, we work in sprints, 2-week sprints, where we create to-do lists every 2 weeks and rinse and repeat. And I noticed that we were basically doing the same thing over and over, and it wasn't moving the business needle. And technically, it was a nonprofit that I was working with, and we were supposed to increase diversity in the workforce. And it didn't feel like we were doing that at all. So I was like, probably not going to do more good staying here. So I think that's how the calculation happened in my mind.
And so from there, you said you had, well, in chatting beforehand, you talked about some other ways that you would have overcome fears in that situation. And there were 3 specific ways. If you could tell us a little bit about those ways that you overcame fears when they arose.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to memento mori. I think that's a verb. It's also a noun. So memento mori is a memento that reminds you that you're going to die. It could be a skull. It's a little creepy, but it could be a tattoo. My friend has a tattoo that says memento mori. Remember that you remember your death. Carpe diem is kind of the flip opposite. So remembering that you're going to die. That's one thing. Remember that, watch things like Steve Jobs' commencement address at Stanford to remember things like this. Maybe you could volunteer with end-of-life patients at the hospital or on people on death row. I met someone who she would go to men on death row, and she would slip them sheets of paper with poetry written on it. And her connection would be one of the last human connections that they had before they were executed. So doing things like that to remember that you're going to die, that will pretty much put your fear in perspective. That's one thing you could do. Another thing to do that is a problem with humans in general is to make visible the invisible. We don't see compound interest, for example, but it's the eighth mystery of the world, according to Einstein. So how do you see make visible the invisible? One of the invisible things is that if you're, drinking, like I said earlier, you're attached to the teats and you're getting a 6 or 7 figure income. What you're losing is your independence. So how do you see that? If you're obese, you see the obesity. But if you're losing your independence, you don't see that. How do you make that visible? Because you're not going to change until you can see it. So remember your death, and remember that you're also losing something. You're losing independence. Also, you're losing your vivacity. If you're fat and happy, you're not going to be, playful like Willy Wonka, or you're not going to be a survivalist. You're not going to be vital.
And I think there was one other, when you were talking about if the new thing you're going into has some rough patches. A lot of people who listen to this podcast, I think, are going from more of a corporate job to the entrepreneurial space. And there may be a lot of things as an entrepreneur that they don't love doing. Maybe it's the writing, maybe it's their own public relations or their own promotions. You had a way to think about those aspects.
Could you jog my memory a bit?
You said about being a writer in Starbucks. Think about.
Oh, yes. There's a beautiful book called On Writing. I think it's by Zinsier. I like books like that about writing. And in these discussions about professional writers, sometimes they're complaining, it's so hard to get the muse to come. I show up at work at 10 in the morning and the muse doesn't come. It's so difficult being a poet, da 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 da. And someone said, why don't you get a job at a factory, show up at 4:30 in the morning, do that for a while, and tell me what hard work is. So unless you're making your income from a trust fund or from investing, you have to work somewhere. So it's going to be tough, probably. So know what real work is, you know what I mean? And if you have the luxury of being an entrepreneur, remember that's a luxury. The least you can do is get out of bed by 9 o'clock. You know what I mean? Or maybe 6 o'clock. You have an awesome opportunity. Get out of bed by 6 o'clock. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that perspective. And you went to Israel, you did your 6 months there, and you came back into another corporate type job, correct?
No, I started coaching immediately when I got back from there.
Oh, okay. I totally misunderstood that because I thought you had two separate quits. One was quitting the.
When I was in Israel, I was doing contract work for software engineering.
Okay.
So I quit that and I said no more income from that skill.
Okay, so we will edit this part out, and I will say, so while you were in Israel, you continued to do contract work, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
What led you to quit that completely and start something new?
Because I knew that if there's a beautiful book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, who popularized the idea of the great books. And he had these people selling great books door to door on a subscription basis. You could have Shakespeare and Galileo and Leibniz and Plato all on your mantle for a small monthly fee. And in his book, How to Read a Book, he talks about how if you understand a book on the first reading, it's not hard enough. You're not pushing yourself. That the mind, you read a book where your mind just can't quite understand. And don't worry, your brain will figure out a way to get there. You'll figure it out. You just got to keep trying. And I think it's the same thing with anything. You throw yourself into the ocean, you're not going to die. The only way you're going to die is if you run out of food, oxygen, or somebody's really getting you. Otherwise, your body will figure out a way to survive. So if you said, Daniel, you have to make it as a professional boxer. I don't want to punch people. I don't want to get punched in the face. But if you said that and it was true, I would figure out a way to survive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Your brain will learn. You'll figure it out.
So you told me before when we were chatting that you saw these problems in the world that you wanted to solve, and that led you to decide to quit the consulting and go out on your own. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the intuition feelings that you had that made you realize, nope, I've really got to cut off the consulting and go do something greater, something more aligned with my mission?
Sure. So the reason why I like the tech space is because it's full of innovation, although I hate the term. And the people that I admire also tend not to like the term, or even the term entrepreneur, because it's becoming common. But a real entrepreneur, a real innovator is somebody who is like taking a weird path. Like Steve Jobs, people don't talk about it, but he backpacked India. He didn't go to Y Combinator. He didn't go to Harvard MBA. He backpacked India. So what does that look like today? Maybe it looks like being quiet and working at a nursing home for 10 years and being with hundreds of people as they die and just listening to them and talking to them. Maybe that's what innovation is. So thinking about that, and also thinking about Buckminster Fuller, he had a beautiful image where he coined the term spaceship Earth, and he created the geodesic dome. He said that those huge ocean liners that move freight from China to America, for example, you need a rudder to turn the ship, right? But even the rudder is like the size of a building. You can't just move the rudder. The rudder has a rudder. It's called a trim tab. It's a beautiful image. So how can you be a trim tab to the rudder to the ship of society? So Steve Jobs, for example, and Elon Musk and other people, there's other people who don't have as much notoriety. They are the trim tab that moves the rudder, that moves the ship. So don't you want to be a trim tab? Or do you want to be part of the ship? You know what I mean? So, and the difficulties are, for example, I read that more Americans die from opiate addiction every year than Americans died in the entire Vietnam War. Well, all the artists and musicians protested the Vietnam War. Where are they today for opiate epidemic? Things like that. When the oil spill happened in the Gulf 10 years ago, it just gushed and gushed and gushed for like 30 days. And it was on CNN, and everyone's like, are we doing anything? Can we do anything? What's happening? And like people just get more and more depressed and like, geez, we're screwing up the planet. But eventually they fixed it. So instead of looking at all these things and becoming nihilistic or focused on being a hedonist, like Aldous Huxley warned, how can you roll up your sleeves and do something about it and be a trim tab? You know what I mean? For the opiate epidemic, plastic in the ocean, young people being nihilistic and pleasure seeking, nuclear weapons, blow the whole place up any day. How can you be a trim tab for this? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to die. You might as well try something.
I love that. I didn't know what a trim tab was beforehand, but now I'm determined to be one for the.
Cool. Thanks, Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you quit consulting and started coaching, and explain exactly the people who you coach, the type of people.
Well, at first, all I had was I'm like a disciplinarian, but I'm also playful. So, and I like accountability partners. So one of my friends, we were accountability partners for years, and I stayed on him intensely like a bulldog, and I wouldn't let go. And he's like, other people were like, why don't you use that as a profession and do coaching? So I thought it'd be wellness counseling, where I'd help people set wellness goals, social, financial, spiritual, so on. Then I realized that almost nobody respects life coaches. And it's hard to make a living with that. So I was like, well, business coaching, where you move revenue, if you increase your revenue 10 times your fee, then it's easy to sell your services. But not just any business. I was like, what about entrepreneurs? Instead of taking a cut like a investor, I would take a flat fee like an attorney. But not just any entrepreneur. What about social enterprise entrepreneurs? People innovating in education, environment, food, community, meaning, things like this. So now, as I understand my business model, I work with people for a flat fee, and I help them increase the revenue of their startup. And it has to be a startup that's doing something about tackling these world challenges. So I help them with accountability, one-on-one calls every week for 3 months, and different transformative tricks that I've learned.
I love that. The reason I wanted Daniel to specifically talk about what he does is because of how creative it is, but how, whether or not you discussed it specifically, what you did was you took the problems that were bothering you in society and like, how can I be a trim tab in these? And then you combined it with the skills that you already had, your strengths. And I think a lot of people, they want to do something, they want to help, they want to make the world a better place, but that is a very broad situation, like, where do we go from there? How do I just make the world a better place and yet still bring in an income for myself? People know how to volunteer for organizations. Technically that makes the world a better place, but it's not going to replace your corporate job. And so I loved how you went through that, and you're like, okay, not only this, but I could take it one step further. And you got to the point where you have merged your great passion for, keeping people accountable with your huge desire to specifically move the needle in these certain, social areas. I think that's great.
I think you're doing it too by guiding people and kind of pushing them and encouraging them to quit, to get into the next phase of their life. And if you study Zig Ziglar, which you should, he'll talk about when you find a product or service that you really believe in, you have a moral obligation to sell and to exchange money. So when you really find something that you believe in, you'll make a business out of it.
I love that. And I think that's a great final message for today. Unless there's anything else about quitting you would like to tell the people out there?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. We've been very, very comprehensive. Daniel is fearless. I just met him today, over this podcast, but I love the sense that I was like, can you talk about your quitting fears? And he was like, fears? I'm like, oh, this is, I like the rare person to where the fear barely is an issue, because he's got such a great concept of, like, we have been given this gift of life, somebody who thinks as much about death as you do, Daniel. Like, that's a very interesting perspective. And I think a lot of people who are dealing with fears, even though we didn't discuss that in depth this much, just the message of remember your mortality, and what do you want to look back on in your life? You want to have moved the needle on something. You don't want to have settled. You want to quit whatever you're settling so that you can go pursue that passion, because it's worth that risk, right?
Yeah, and you have the opportunity because you're alive to do it. So do it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your story today with us, Daniel.
Thank you for doing this. This is a really cool podcast.
I appreciate that. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time, happy quitting.